Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched The Crown season 6 part 1. Let's talk about it. So The Crown is back with its final season. Yes, Netflix released the final season of The Crown today, but only the first part because they want you to stay subscribed until December. So they only released the first part of season 6 on their platform, and I immediately watched it because I am a huge fan of this series. Guys, I have reviews for the previous seasons of The Crown on my channel if you want to check them out, but many of you will know that I'm a huge fan of the show, even if I'm not the biggest fan of its subject matter. But a lot of things have changed over the years as new seasons of The Crown have continued to drop on Netflix. I mean, we literally have a whole new monarch at this point. So the Crown's main subject matter, Queen Elizabeth II, is no longer with us and she's no longer our monarch. So I feel like the real life events have definitely impacted the events that are depicted in the history of the Windsor family on the show, which we'll talk about in a second. But overall, I would say the series has maintained a consistent level of quality throughout its entirety. It's by far one of the best shows on the Netflix platform. Let's be real. It's one of their most prestigious shows and one of their most expensive. And I think it will leave behind a massive gaping hole when it finally comes to an end. But in the meantime, we have a lot to discuss when it comes to the final season of The Crown so far. But before we get into all of that good stuff, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now, without further ado, guys, let's get into The Crown season 6 part 1. So I think most people in the world alive today, at least above the age of like 15 or so, will know who Princess Diana was, right? Like, we should be on the same page on that front, right? She was famous for, of course, marrying into the Windsor family, being Charles's wife for some time, but then things broke down, you know, tragically and very publicly. But she continued with her life post-separation and then divorce, and she became known in her own right for her great charitable efforts and just for being a very compassionate, open person. And that was very different to the public personas of the members of the royal family, who were seen as way more closed off and traditionalist and backwards to some extent, and just not as approachable. She brought a whole new light and a whole new meaning to royalty in the country, and she will forever be remembered for that. And so when you have that background knowledge of the weight of the legacy of this person, then you know for sure that Peter Morgan has a task on his hands when it comes to depicting her incredibly tragic death. And so he dedicates the first half of the final season of The Crown to this, to unraveling the events that took place weeks before Princess Diana's horrible, tragic death, alongside her boyfriend or friend Dodi, as well as, of course, the bodyguard and driver who was also in the car. So the first thing that we get in this season is the car crash, but this time it's shown through a different perspective, that of a random Frenchman who's just walking his dog in the middle of the night, and he more hears than sees the car crash take place in the tunnel, and he immediately calls for the police or ambulance, just someone to come and help, because it just sounds so horrific and horrifying. So the series starts off with the end point, but then we rewind back 8 weeks and we see Diana on this holiday in Saint-Tropez, and she is actually with her sons for this first holiday early on in the summer of 97, so that she can spend as much time with them as she can before they head on over to Scotland, Balmoral, where the royal family has a castle and they often spend their summers there. So she's just trying to soak in the sun and, you know, have fun with her sons as well. And they're there as guests of Mohammed Al-Fayed, who is, of course, the Egyptian man that we were introduced to in the previous season. He was a very wealthy man who ended up buying Harrods, or a huge stake in Harrods or something, as well as the Ritz. And so, you know, with all of this wealth and all of this prosperity and success, he expected the royal family to welcome him with open arms as part of the traditional aristocracy, to kind of legitimize him in that way, because he was used to kind of living under the British thumb whilst they colonized Egypt. He still saw that as being aspirational, and it drove a lot of what he did, even throughout his life, even at that late stage. More on that later, because I think it's a very interesting conversation to be had there. But that is mostly the reason why he stays so close to Diana. He likes that proximity to royalty that she provides him, and I'm sure she likes the fact that he offers her these fancy holidays for free. And they've maintained their friendship over the years, from when they met, as was shown in the previous season. Now, a lot of time in this first half of the season is spent depicting the fancy holidays that Diana went on, you know, when she was on these gorgeous yachts, and you have some of the iconic photographs that were taken by paparazzi as they followed her around on these boats. And it gives you the sense of her trying to break free from the establishment, break free from the royal family, and just, you know, be in a completely different headspace. It just goes to show you the kind of life that she wanted for herself, when she wasn't, you know, attached to the hip with Charles. So it's a different existence that they depict, the contrast between what the Windsors are up to over the summer with their very traditional visit to Balmoral, and the traditions that they stick to with, you know, William killing the, is it a deer? The animal. I think it's a deer, right? They very much stuck to their traditions, stuck to what they know, whereas Diana is kind of living this life of luxury that is very nouveau riche in comparison. But still, even in her happiest moments where she has her sons on holiday with her, and they do make it a point to show that she's so much happier with them there, because even though she's having a grand old time on this yacht, like, let's be real, any of us would love to have a grand old time on these yachts. Or if you have an invitation to take me on a yacht, please let me know. Please reach out, comment down below. But even though she's having a fun time, obviously, there's still a real sense of loneliness, and a real sense of a lack of belonging. You know, the fact that she's just floating around in these oceans kind of emphasizes that, even though it is historically accurate, but thematically it plays into the idea that she's kind of floating by and she doesn't really have much stability to her in comparison to the Windsors, who have great stability, right? They're in Balmoral Castle, which has been around for centuries, and they're, you know, rock solid in the foundations. That contrast is also very fascinating, but the fact that they make a point to show just how happy she is being with her sons in the early part of the summer, it just goes to show you how fulfilling she found motherhood to be, even though it came with a lot of pain and a lot of distress because of her marriage to Charles. Now, the contrast that is depicted between Diana's luxurious holidays on these yachts versus the very traditional holiday that the Windsors are having over at Balmoral Castle also serves to demonstrate just how hard things were for Diana to maintain a relationship with her sons as a divorcee. As the Queen says herself in the show, you know, when you're out, you're out. And Diana is starting to experience what it means to be out of the royal family. There is no middle ground, despite her pleading to Tony Blair to give her some sort of official position to allow her to take on more duties, take on more responsibilities and do more good work. You know, she's eager to get out there and do something, but according to these old written rules, according to these traditions and how the establishment works, she isn't permitted to do anything because she's no longer in the family, and so she has no role to play. She has no official duties. She's just a private citizen at this point. Also, also, as I said before, it plays into her role as a mother, because even though she is no longer a Windsor, the boys very much are. You know, her oldest son is the future king, and so he needs to be stationed with the Windsor family. And so she has the right to, you know, contact them, you know, book these telephone calls and try to see them as much as she can, scheduling in these times. But it just feels like she's a member of the extended family. Like, there's such a separation there that is so bizarre, especially for a mother who wants to be in her children's lives. In the case of the Windsor family, where they're trying to raise future monarchs and future royals and that, it feels like they no longer see the need for Diana, because the boys have their father and the nannies and the rest of the family, and she's just like an inconvenience for them. And it's just really sad, because, you know, the Windsors, they have their family unit, despite how toxic, cold and problematic it may be, but Diana is just on her own. You know, she only has her sons, and so when they take them away from her, it's just really heartbreaking to see how alone and unbalanced she is. And it makes matters so much worse when you realize that pretty much everyone in her life was there to get something from her. Even Mumu, okay, even Mohammed Al-Fayed, who, you know, is acting as this paternal figure, this wonderful friend, so generous, so kind. And I'm sure he, you know, had very favorable and positive feelings towards her, but he was also playing an angle there, because, you know, he wanted to be seen as legitimate amongst the aristocracy, but there was always a separation there, because at the end of the day, he is an Arab man who comes from a country that was colonized by the British, so he would never be seen as equal by them, although again, we'll talk about it later. But Mumu is yet another example of someone who wanted something from Diana, even going as far as to push his son Dodi to try and, you know, nab her, to try and marry her so that she would officially be a part of the Al-Fayed family, giving him that kind of connection to the Windsors that he so desperately wants, as well as potentially British citizenship. But even in the few times where we see Diana on land, okay, you know, spending time for herself, she's visiting psychics who, depending on, you know, how you feel about psychics, is still someone who wants something from you, right? It's someone who wants your employ. But it shows that these are the only people that she's able to speak to. But the most contentious relationship that Diana had, the most life-sucking relationship in the literal sense that she had, was the quasi-relationship with the paparazzi and the press. And this is something that is hammered home this season so effectively, because what the actual F? Leave this woman alone. Wow. Now this season did such a brilliant job of showing us, of demonstrating the beginnings of the end when it came to journalism, when it came to photographers, that whole culture, the toxicity that ensued, because Princess Diana was one of the first, if not the very first, you know, celebrities or public figures to experience this incredibly insatiable, toxic paparazzi culture that began to breed, that began to grow in the early 2000s. It all started with her, because these paparazzos were absolutely insane, okay? They were unrelenting, they were unsympathetic, and as we saw, eventually they were lethal. These guys were following her around everywhere, and it was just unbearable. And the series does a brilliant job of bringing you into her headspace and showing you just how maddening it would have been. Every single time you go anywhere, from the living room to the bathroom, you are followed by photographers. What is going on? What is this existence? But she was one of the most famous people in the world at this time. And as the series shows, one single picture of her could give these photographers a whole new life. It could make them rich, because these publications were paying so much money for these photographs, especially if they were scandalous, especially if they were saucy, right? If she's kissing Dodi, or if she's, you know, in a bikini or in a swimsuit, then those pictures, the prices for those pictures would just continue to go up. Now, going back to the relationship side of things, yes, it is showing that Diana had a relationship with a lot of these these photographers. She knew these guys, and perhaps she would make deals with them to depict herself in a certain light. Maybe she would say, listen, today is not my day, okay? Today I forgot my foundation, you know, I forgot my favorite perfume. Just give me a break today. Tomorrow I'm gonna come out here. Oh, I'm gonna be looking good. I'm gonna be wearing my Dior, my Versace glasses. So like, you just hold on until tomorrow. Okay, get back to me tomorrow. You know, they had that kind of symbiotic relationship where, you know, Diana may have wanted to be portrayed in a certain way, may have wanted attention towards certain events that she was a part of, like her philanthropic effort. So in exchange for some ease in, you know, certain situations, she may have negotiated with them in order to portray herself in the way that she wanted to the public. And they're all for it because they're going to get the coverage, they're going to get the exclusives, they're going to get the bank. And so that symbiotic relationship may have worked really well for both of them up until a point. And to be clear, this is something that exists within the royal family as well. Don't get it twisted. All of these lot do the same thing, okay? A lot of these celebrities, okay, learn from the book of Diana. They be calling paparazzi on themselves. Don't get it confused. Don't get it twisted. It's not just a coinky dink that these press happen to be everywhere that these celebrities go. Oftentimes it is all staged and planned in order to send us, the mere measly public, a message. So there may have been a similar arrangement with Diana and the press, as the royal family have had with much of the press for decades, centuries even perhaps. But the difference is that in the late 1990s to the early 2000s, this new culture, this insidious culture of paparazzi was born, and it just blew out of proportion because it was no longer about having these staged images of public figures anymore. It was about capturing moments of humiliation and shame and degradation with these public figures and celebrities to show us, the public, look, this person that you look up to, this person that you find so admirable and so perfect is actually just like you, if not worse. And the public lapped it up, probably because they were sick and tired of the decades of the staging, right? Okay, of the false perfection. And so they lapped up this new reality, and it became extremely profitable for the newspapers and also for the paparazzos taking these photos. But of course, whenever money is involved, wherever there's money to be found somewhere, you are going to see a proliferation of nonsense. You're going to see people lose their freaking mind. And unfortunately, even with the devastating results that was Princess Diana's tragic passing, these paparazzos still did not learn their lessons because we still had celebrities being chased by them. Look at what happened to Britney Spears in the early 2000s. It was appalling. It was a horrible culture within the media that I think was only tempered by social media and the emergence of a new brand of celebrity and influencer that kind of killed off this intense paparazzo culture from the early 2000s. That's a very interesting conversation to have for another day. But my point is that the series did a really great job of depicting this suffocation that Diana was feeling as a result of the press. Now, if I did have one critique of how they handled Diana's storyline in part one, it would be that I would have liked to see a little bit more of her philanthropy being displayed this season. They do show us the iconic moment where she was walking across the landmine field, and that's something that was also depicted in Diana, the 2011 or 13 film. But as I mentioned before, Princess Diana was famous for her charitable and philanthropic efforts. You know, she really showed a lot of care and compassion for people who were suffering in this world, whether it be due to wars or epidemics or pandemics. You know, she was there providing a lot of support and a lot of love towards those affected, and that's why she had such a special place in people's hearts. And I would have liked to see that be emphasized a little bit more in this season, because there was only a mention of some of her other work with AIDS patients, for instance, but we didn't actually get a chance to see it. To be fair, the series is called The Crown and it's supposed to focus on Liz, who has definitely taken a back seat over the last couple of seasons, which we'll talk about in a second. But I still think, you know, it would have been beneficial for the show to highlight even more of what Diana did, because we've had seasons of seeing what Liz was doing, but just to really hammer home how special she was as a member of the royal family and as a public figure, it would have been nice to see more. And also, let's not forget that this series is coming out in 2023, where there have been a bunch of people born, okay, since 1997, who don't really remember Princess Diana and don't really know why she was such a significant figure, both, you know, in the UK and worldwide. And so I think the series takes it for granted that we all know, but, you know, a lot of people don't know. So we need to show and not just tell. Another critique that I have for the Diana storyline, I mean, it's not a major critique. You guys let me know what you thought of this, but the ghost sequences. I get what they were trying to do, to allow us to have more moments of interactions between some of the key players in the Windsor family with Diana post her death. So for instance, she has one scene in the private jet with Charles, where she's talking to him after she has already died, and when he is coming back from Paris, having picked up her body, and they're saying things that, you know, was left unsaid, and it's supposed to give you a sense of closure for the characters, but it's just a scotch cheesy to some extent. Just a smidge cheesy. I mean, we didn't really get moments like that when George VI passed away in the first season of the show. You didn't really get a post-death emotional talk between him and his daughter when she became queen. So like, it's interesting that they've chosen to go down that route when it comes to Diana. But I understand more of Elizabeth Debicki in this role is always welcome. We'll talk about it in a second, okay? But the second instance is, of course, in Balmoral Castle with the Queen, where the Queen is contemplating whether or not to break tradition, break protocol, and, you know, step into London to show, you know, public support for the mourning of this great figure. And, you know, they have this conversation where the Queen is like, I hope you're happy now, you know, you've done what you came here to do, you've turned this whole house upside down. And she's saying, that's not what I wanted, you know, that's not what I intended, but maybe you need to listen to the public. They're telling you what they want from you. And it's all very nice and touching and emotional and sentimental, but just a scotch cheesy. But I can't go any further into this review without giving a huge standing ovation to Elizabeth Debicki, because wow. Because wow, did I tell you guys, I don't know if I mentioned in my review of the previous season, did I tell you that I saw her? Yeah. I'm pretty sure I saw her. I was going on my walk, in a park near me, and I just see this like really long woman, this really tall woman, and I'm like, is that Elizabeth Debicki? But I was looking a bit of a shambles, and like I wasn't about to go up to her. Are you joking? But I think she may have been in the area because she was shooting for the show, and so I'm pretty sure it was her. Oh, if only I had asked for a picture with the icon, because she was absolutely phenomenal this season. She was brilliant last season as well. We got to see this new grown version of Diana last season, and she was a true evolution of the Diana that was depicted by Emma Corrin so brilliantly. But here she really has time to shine. The spotlight is on her as we go through the events leading up to her tragic passing, and Elizabeth Debicki just has such incredible grace and poise. She has the mannerisms down pat, but it doesn't feel like theatrical. It doesn't feel overly dramatic or like an imitation. It just feels like it's a natural part of her. The way that she's talking, the way that she holds her head, these are all signature Diana moves, but it's just become such a part of Elizabeth Debicki's being that it just feels so natural. I mean, The Crown has done an exceptional job in the past of casting these actors to portray these iconic figures, and Elizabeth Debicki is right up there with some of the best in The Crown's past casts, because she nails it in this role. But even though Princess Diana wasn't as tall as Elizabeth clearly is, I actually think it's an unintentionally clever way of putting the spotlight on her constantly, so she stands out from the crowd, and oh my god, were there crowds. But she's so easily recognizable because of obviously the iconic blonde hair, but also because of how tall she is, that she literally stands out like a sore thumb wherever wherever she goes. So it constantly feels like the spotlight is on her, even though she's crouching down, trying to make herself small. And so again, it just works thematically somehow to have her be this tall figure that's kind of larger than life. But okay, before we dive into the Windsors, let's take a bit of a detour to the Egyptians. Okay, we're looking at the Al-Fayed men, and as I mentioned before, when it comes to Papa Al-Fayed, okay, when it comes to Muhammad, who I believe recently passed away in real life, so RIP to him. But you know, he was a very interesting figure because, as we saw in season 5, he grew up in British occupied Egypt, and so he grew up around the aristocracy. He saw how they acted, how they behaved, and their, you know, traditions and mannerisms, and he wanted to emulate that. He wanted to copy that essentially, and he thought he could buy his way into that culture. But in reality, as an Arab man, that was never going to happen. There was always going to be a wall there to prevent him from having full access and legitimacy into the British aristocracy. And just as a side note, this is one of the main sort of differences between British and American culture, for instance, because whilst they're both capitalistic societies, in America, once you have contributed to capitalism as much as you can and you are gaining all of that yummy income, you can call yourself middle class or upper middle class. You can buy your way up the social status ladder. But in the case of the UK, even if you are on a 6-figure salary somehow in this economy, good for you. Good for you. But even if you are there, you'd be hard pressed to call yourself middle class or upper middle class unless you come from a middle class family. It's something that's just so deeply entrenched in British culture. There is no specific marker for what makes you a part of a certain class. It's not just about your income, it's about your family, it's about your heritage, etc. and so forth. And so that's why you have, you know, people in the UK who are earning 6-figure salaries and then some being like, yeah, I'm working class. Yeah, I'm working class. It's because they don't see themselves as middle class or upper middle class or even upper class because they don't have that pedigree. So that's one of the main differences between the two cultures, and that's something that Muhammad Al-Fayed had to contend with because he was trying to buy his way into the aristocracy. But in reality, sir, there is no purchase price, okay? It's not something that you can just buy your way into. In fact, a lot of the aristocracy is poor. If you watch Guy Ritchie's The Gentleman, a lot of the aristocracy are stuck in these massive houses that they can't afford to maintain, but they're still considered the aristocracy because of their history, because of their pedigree and their heritage. Now, I was getting concerned for Muhammad because he was allowing this pursuit of legitimacy in the British aristocracy to destroy everything around him, including his relationship with his son. But I was so glad that they did have that post-death conversation between Muhammad and Dodi, where he tells him, stop trying to pursue Western acceptance. Like because I was saying this the whole time. The whole 2 seasons, I was like, Muhammad, wake up, they're never going to accept you, or you're too brown. You're a brown man, okay? You're not the same as them. And so I was so glad that from beyond the grave, Dodi told him exactly what I have been saying for the last 2 seasons, okay? Because they're never going to accept an Arab man. They're never look at what they did to Meghan. Hey. These people are not serious. These people are not your friends, or okay, they will use you and then throw you away because you are not one of them and you never will be. So I'm so glad that that message was hammered home at the end. And I was also really glad that The Crown did something that it rarely does, which is depicting other people's cultures and traditions. And it showed how, you know, Muhammad was grieving his son, and he had a very public funeral for his son amongst those in his community. First of all, it gave us, you know, an example of 2 different ways that people and cultures deal with loss and deal with death, which I think was really beautiful. But also there was such a sense of dignity subtlety in that scene, because so much of this series has focused on the, you know, royal traditions and royal customs and protocol, and they were still discussing that in the background. But to see how another culture also has its own traditions that it takes pride in and that brings people from this culture together was also very inspiring, especially because, as is mentioned on the show, when many people think of the tragic night when Princess Diana passed away in that car crash, they forget that there were 3 other people in that car with her who also lost their lives, and Dodi was one of them. So I predict that the story of Mohammed Al-Fayed has come to a close on The Crown with the first part of this final season, you know, seeing him mourn the loss of his son, who he pushed and pushed and pushed to try and get the most out of him, to help him in his mission to be accepted by the British aristocracy. But it's been so fascinating to see the contrast between Mohammed and Diana in this first part of the final season. The fact that Diana wanted to break free of the shackles that was the royal family, and she wanted to start a life of her own and pursue something by herself. But on the flip side, you have Mohammed, who's trying to worm his way in by any means necessary, and desperately so, even after all these years, and despite the fact that he would never be seen as a legitimate member of this elusive class in British society. I have to say, Salim Dor and Khaled Abdallah were brilliant as Mohammed and Dodi respectively, especially Salim Dor, who is absolutely phenomenal and has been for the past 2 seasons. I mean, especially the scenes where he is so sad and just broken over the death of his son, which just like shook me to my core. So he has always been a phenomenal addition to this cast. But Khalid also had a great performance this season. We saw, I think, a glimpse of him last season, but this season where you have this very awkward, very shy person who clearly is not comfortable in the spotlight but is being pushed by this soccer mum, basically, in the form of his father, to pursue great things, to be half the man that his father is, at least in his eyes, and it's just like wrecking him. He's just not up to task. Okay, so now that we have gone through the Diana side of things, which pretty much makes up the majority of this first part of season 6, let's touch on the Windsors for a little bit, shall we? Because they're also there, and they're hanging out in Balmoral, as I said, is tradition for their summer holidays. But in this season, they're relegated to spectators. We see them learning of news of Diana's life through, you know, phone calls from their press secretaries, or from newspaper headlines, or, you know, TV coverage. And so there's a lot of distance there, both geographically but also in terms of their relationship with Diana, because the only thing that's tethering them together are the 2 boys. Now, as we've seen for the past few seasons, when it comes to Charles, the big issue of the day is his relationship with Camilla. I'm gonna behave. Anyways, so his relationship with Camilla, and this time around there seems to be this PR war because Camilla's having her 50th birthday, but it's being overshadowed by Diana. Like, just whatever. And even the Queen at one point is just like, I'm going to Derbyshire. She's like, I'm going to Derbyshire, I'm not going there. Like, what do you want me to do? Charles is like, oh, you need to be seen there in order to legitimize Camilla. Another person seeking legitimacy. You need to go to her birthday party, it'll make a big difference. And the Queen's just like, no. And Charles is like, oh, but you need to go because otherwise people will think that you don't approve. And the Queen's just like, I don't. Like, what do you want me to do? I don't approve. So yeah, that's a bit of drama where they're having this, you know, publicity battle where, you know, Diana is seen as this angel and this maverick amongst the press and the public, and Charles is just this stuffy guy who left his wife for Camilla. So he's trying to improve his and Camilla's public image because after all, he is going to be the future king. So that should take precedence amongst the Windsors and amongst the establishment. But ironically, with our art imitating life. Charles and Camilla's storyline very much takes a back seat this season, thankfully. So so it's like, you know, they're crying about the press and whatnot, but like, who cares really? The main storyline when it comes to the Windsors this first half of the season is in their response to Princess Diana's death. Now, interestingly, for those of you who don't know, Peter Morgan, the showrunner and the writer of this show, has already covered this subject quite extensively because he was the screenplay writer of 2006 The Queen, which is the film that won Helen Mirren her Oscar. But that film centered on this specific period in time in the Queen's life where Princess Diana had passed away, and it was focused on her response to that passing and the fact that the response was very cold and actually just non-existent at first. Okay, for a good week or so she just didn't do anything. She was just holed up in Balmoral, and their excuse was like, oh, they're looking out for the boys, like her grandchildren, blah blah blah. But it very much felt like the family had, you know, divorced themselves from Diana and anything to do with her, both in life and death. And so people found it to be really cold, and they became extremely unpopular, and that unpopularity bled into the early 2000s to the point where people had all sorts of conspiracies about the royal family's involvement in Diana's passing. So they were very unpopular in the early 2000s, and still to this day that impact is felt. But as I said, this is a subject matter that Peter Morgan is very well acquainted with, and as someone who has seen The Queen from 2006, I see a lot of similarity here in the way that it played out. But of course, with a series you get to kind of expand upon these things. They have this storyline where William has run away for 14 hours, so they're just adding a lot more drama to it. But essentially it hits the same beats of the Queen being reluctant to step outside of protocol for Diana, whether it be for personal reasons or because she's the crown and whatever. The main difference here is that Charles is very empathetic. Charles, did you notice that? I'm not the only one who noticed, right? Charles is very empathetic post Diana's death. Oh, he's just so full of regrets, and he's so sad, and he wants to do right by her in death, even if he wasn't able to in life. And so he goes out to Paris to, you know, see her body and bring it back home as he did in real life. And he sees people crowding around the car. He sees people just so sad and so beside themselves over her passing. And so he's able to get a read on public sentiment, and he knows that people want the Queen to respond, to show emotion, to show empathy in this time of public mourning, not just across the country but around the world. Now, this is the point in time when we remember that a lot of this is made up. Okay, so we don't actually know the conversations that took place within Balmoral Castle during this time. We don't know if Charles was as much of an advocate for, you know, Diana having a public funeral worthy of the other royals during this time either. But what we do know is that Charles is now king. And the way that he's been depicted in this final season is a lot more favourable. I wonder why. Now, the Queen eventually does make a speech addressing the tragic passing of Diana, which is televised and was in real life. And having seen Helen Mirren as well as now Imelda Staunton recreating this speech, I would say both of them had very similar temperaments to the Queen at that time. They did a really good job of replicating that moment. Who was better? I would say Helen Mirren. First of all, just visually, she looked a lot more like the Queen at that time. And also, I would say she disappeared into the role a lot more than Imelda Staunton has been able to. Unfortunately, I still think that Imelda is the weakest of the Queen Elizabeths that we have gotten so far, I'm sorry to say. But I don't think it's wholly her fault. I think it's just the nature of the show at this point. It's just become the Diana show. She's unfortunately saddled with playing out the Queen's later years, where she kind of disappeared into the background to make room for the new generation of royals, whether it be in a positive light or not. We do have a very emotional aspect to the storyline, and that is, of course, through the boys, William and Harry, who we see here portrayed as, you know, older boys for the first time, and they're now more recognizable as the William and Harry that we know now. for all their faults and flaws. But it is so sad to see them walking ahead of their mother's coffin. This was a scene that was seen by millions of people around the world, and a lot of people still have that image of them when they think of the princes. So yeah, it was really, really tragic to see how their mother's passing affected them. Again, this is all speculation and conjecture, but we can see the impact of their mother's passing on them to this day. And I think it was particularly sad when you consider some real life events that have taken place since then, like the breakdown of their brotherhood. But you know, we're not going to get too much into that because that's not covered on the show. But overall, guys, when it comes to the first part of the final season of The Crown, we have a return to form here. This has been a very, very strong season so far, where we're seeing these brilliant performances, but also this very, you know, heavy and troublesome time in the Windsor family history being handled very deftly, very delicately, but also in a really powerful way to demonstrate the environment that these people existed in during this time, especially with the press lurking over their shoulders constantly. I think that was just really, really effective. Now, there's no score from me yet because, of course, we have the second half of the season coming up in December. But in the meantime, that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on The Crown Season 6 Part 1, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this season so far down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch you videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.